Hi everyone. So this week's Parsha, this week's Torah portion is Teruma. And in it, it starts by God telling Moshe to tell the Jewish people, or to take from the Jewish people trumot, donations that they give willingly, voluntarily, from which the mikdash, the sanctuary, will be built. And then later on, it says that God will dwell among them, among the Jewish people, with the help of the sanctuary, V'asuli mikdash, and make for me a sanctuary, v'shachanti b'tocham, and I'll dwell amongst them. And there's something interesting about the language of that first verse, where it says, V'yikhuli truma, they'll take for me a truma, a donation that they're going to take willingly, voluntarily, and they're going to give voluntarily. And there's something interesting about the language of taking and giving here, that the word is vaikhu, they'll take, rather than just that they'll be asked to give. It's like take from them something that they will give voluntarily. So what is this kind of play of giving and taking here? And the Midrash picks up on this play, on this wording of giving and taking together, and it relates this verse to a verse in Mishlei. It says, "Lekach ki lekach tov natati lachem, torati al tazo," because I gave you a good instruction or good lessons. And so don't abandon my Torah. So here also it starts with ki lekach tov natati lachem, for I gave you a good teaching. Lekach is translated as kind of conclusion or instruction, a lesson, but it's from the word lakach. It's from the word take. It's what you can take from something, a kind of take home lesson. What do you take from something? So here also it's like a good taking that God is giving us. There's the taking and the giving. And so it's a play on the same relationship between taking and giving is coming together here in this verse. And so the Midrash connects between these two verses, and it says that there's a way in which when God gives us the Torah, he also doesn't want to leave it. He wants to give it to us without leaving it, without not having it anymore. And the kind of analogy the Midrash brings is of a king who wants to give his daughter in marriage to somebody, but the king is really attached to his daughter, and so he doesn't want her to go away without him. And so he agrees to give her in marriage to this person, but then he says that I'm going to come along with you, and I'm going to live with you, stay with you wherever you are, so then I'll get to still be with my daughter. So this analogy that the Midrash uses it for God's giving of the Torah to us. So God wants to give us the Torah, but he also doesn't want to leave it in some sense. He doesn't want to give it to us and thereby it be only with us and not with him. And so his dwelling amongst us, his v'shachanti b'tocham, his dwelling amongst the Jewish people is like a way of staying with the Torah, even though he gave it to us. So it's this interesting analogy here that also has to do with giving without losing, giving that doesn't mean not having anymore. And so this can kind of bring us back to the play on giving and taking in Vaikhuli Truma, that they should take for me a truma, a donation, and with that build a dwelling place for me. So what does that mean? How is it that this voluntary donation, it's a donation that has to be voluntary? And we could ask, how is it that this voluntary donation that is taken in some sense, but it's voluntary? How is it that ultimately allows for God to dwell amongst us in the sanctuary that we make with those donations? And we can look to the Mea Shiloach, the Hasidic commentary on the Parsha of Mordechai Leiner of Ishbitz, the Ishbitzer Rebbe. Talks about how and on a this worldly kind of physical plane, opposite qualities are mutually exclusive. Giving and taking are mutually exclusive. Either you're giving something or you're taking it. If you can't have your cake and eat it too, you can't give something away and still have it in some sense. And in general, whenever we have mutually we have opposite qualities in on a kind of this worldly physical plane, we have to choose between them. But he says on a deeper spiritual plane, when we go to the root of the things, the kind of spiritual root of things, on a higher plane that's beyond this physical world, then opposite qualities, we can actually see that they have a common source. They're actually unified. One of the examples that the Mashiach brings is fear and love, or yirah and ahava, awe and love, which on a kind of this worldly understanding, we might think of them as opposite emotions or opposite ways of relating to something. But he says on a deeper plane, at the root of these things, they're actually unified. And then in general, when we relate to things as part of divine service, or as being for the service of the divine, then we can also access this place from which opposites are unified, and they're not mutually exclusive. They can come together in the service of God. And so giving and taking is a good example of this, that when we think about physical goods and physical giving, then the more you give, the less you have. If you give, then you don't have what you gave, and so now you have less. But when it comes to a kind of a different kind of giving, and giving on a spiritual plane, a giving that's less physical, material, then there's a way in which the more you give, the more you have. There's a way in which the giving itself can be something that you get, something that you gain just by giving. And so the Mashiach connects this to the story of Veikuli Teruma, of taking this voluntary donation. And so I think we can ask how is it, and it's again related to what the Midrash is saying about God's giving us the Torah without losing it. It's like a giving and getting that's not mutually exclusive. And it seems like in this first verse, it says "Vayikhu teruma," and take for me a giving, take for me a donation. It's a kind of giving. It's a hint to the idea that it's a giving and a getting that aren't mutually exclusive. That actually, by this voluntary giving, we're also getting, we're also taking, and that's what allows God to dwell amongst us. And so we can ask how that is. How is it that this kind of giving in particular is what can allow God to dwell amongst us, and why is it that it has to be voluntary? So I think there's a hint in the Mashiach to how to answer that question, because he talks about how it's in when we do things specifically in divine service, with the consciousness that we're doing it in divine service, then that's what allows us to access the root of opposites, where they're actually unified, where these opposites are not really mutually exclusive. It's that consciousness of doing things for out of divine service and for divine service, that allows us to access a place where opposites are no longer mutually exclusive but unified. And so also the giving and the getting, if we're doing it, if we're giving from a kind of regular, ordinary physical consciousness, then giving leaves us with less than we had. But if we're giving with a consciousness that we're doing it for divine service, that it's part of our service of the divine, and it's something that we want to do for its own sake, for the sake of being connected to God's will, and thereby, in a sense, for its own sake, then by having that consciousness, we access the place where giving and getting are not mutually exclusive. And so we thereby get. It's a way of shifting our perspective on what we're doing that allows us to get by giving, because we're conscious of doing something because it's God's will, doing something for divine service, and that thereby gives us something. So if we go back to the idea that this allows God to dwell amongst us. And this creates a sanctuary that allows God to dwell amongst us. We can see this dwelling amongst us as being a dwelling in our consciousness by virtue of the fact that we shift our perspective in this way and give from a kind of voluntary place of wanting to serve God. Then that allows God, that by nature, just by the very fact of allowing that into our consciousness, that allows God to dwell in our consciousness. And so there's this giving and taking that happens at the same time, giving and receiving that's happening together there. And that is at the same time allowing God to do a giving that's also a taking, or a giving that's also a keeping. That's what allows God to, so to speak, stay with his Torah when he gives it to us, because he's dwelling within us and with our kind of everyday, this worldly observance and learning of the Torah. And so it's our shift in perspective, our kind of voluntary shift into wanting to give from this place of wanting to serve God, that allows both us to go into this consciousness of giving and receiving as not being mutually exclusive but mutually supportive, and also allows God to be with us, to dwell amongst us in a way that brings together the giving and the taking. So it's a kind of unification of the giving and the taking on both sides, and that's hinted at here in Velakuli Truma. And that's why we see that it has to be voluntary by nature. It's not just that we wouldn't want it to be involuntary. It's that it's by virtue of the state of consciousness, of the perspective that we do it from. That's what allows God to dwell amongst us, and that's what allows it to be a giving that's also a receiving and giving, by which we only gain and don't lose anything. Thank you.